What is up, guys? Welcome back to my channel where I put out new photography related content every single Monday. So if you like this video and you want to see more like it, you can check out the rest of the videos on my channel and hit that subscribe button to get a new video every Monday. Today's video is going to be about the Film Photography Iceberg. So if you haven't seen an iceberg video before, basically we're going to be looking at this little graphic here, which was not made by me. I found this on r/analog circle jerk. And we're going to go down tier by tier and talk about each of the entries at each level of the iceberg. So I personally have watched many of these iceberg videos. There's ones for unsolved mysteries, mysterious deaths, true crime. When I saw a graphic for the Film Photography Iceberg, I got pretty excited because there's a bunch of entries on this list that I didn't know about prior to researching for this video, and it was an exciting opportunity to research them and then talk about them to you guys. Plus, I love iceberg videos, and so I'm really happy that I have a chance to make one. So this is part 1. There will be a part 2, and in part 1 we're going to talk about tiers 1 to 5. And stay tuned next week for part 2, which is going to be tiers 6 to 10. So without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about the Film Photography Iceberg. Tier 1, we have tones and vibes. And this is a meme, basically, that new film photographers go nuts over the color and contrast that film provides, and it's all about the tones and the vibes. It's kind of self-explanatory. And there's a ton of memes about it, especially on r/analog circle jerk, so I totally see why this was at the very tip of the iceberg. Number 2 is disposables. This is how a lot of people start with film photography, and this is also how I started with film photography. And I love them, they're great. Go try them out if you don't want to commit to buying a film camera, but you will still want to try out the medium. The next entry we have is, they still make film? Which is a question that I get asked in every social setting where I'm not surrounded by photographers and I have my film camera with me. Oftentimes people will stop me in the street and be like, is that a film camera? They still make film? And then we'll have a chat about, yes, they do still make film, but not enough of it, unfortunately. And the final entry of tier 1, we're just blasting through this tier, is hashtag 35mm, which is the film photography hashtag on Instagram. I tag all of my film photos with hashtag 35mm, and it's just kind of a joke because it's so broad. It's like tagging a photo with hashtag digital. It is the most common, I believe, film hashtag on Instagram. And so that brings us to tier 2, and the first entry on tier 2 is point and shoots. Point and shoots are one of my favorite parts about film photography, that you can pick up a cheap hunk of plastic and shoot with it and get cool results. If you're a good photographer, you can get good photos with pretty much anything, and I love that about film. So I did a whole video on novelty cameras, and I talked about all kinds of point and shoots in that video, so if you're interested, go check it out. Next to disposables, point and shoots is definitely the best way to get started with film. The next entry on this list is the Canon AE1, which I did not know about before I research for this video, but it is one of the best-selling film cameras of all time. It was Canon's attempt to basically undercut the competition. It was Canon's answer to Nikon, Minolta, Olympus, and Pentax. Each of those companies had their own film cameras on the market, but Canon was able to undercut them with the cheaply manufactured Canon AE1, which wound up being one of the best-selling film cameras of all time, and is to this day one of the most accessible kind of entry-level film cameras that a lot of newcomers tend to buy. The next entry on this list, I would absolutely not recommend to newcomers, but newcomers do tend to shoot with it, and that is Portra 400. And the reason why I don't recommend it to newcomers is because it is like $25 Canadian per box, which is insane. Like, that is 2 rolls of a fancy novelty film, or 3 rolls of kind of a basic like Fuji Superia or Kodak Gold 200 film. So save your money, buy Kodak Gold 200, and shoot more film rather than shooting Portra 400. It does, however, have beautiful colors. It is specially graded to be good for skin tones and color saturation, so it does have really beautiful results. But honestly, what I would do, I would shoot on Kodak Gold 200 and then edit it in post. Is that illegal? And then the next entry is hashtag films not dead, which is another film photography hashtag that I certainly tag all of my film photos with. Once you've moved on from hashtag 35mm and hashtag film, hashtag films not dead, hashtag I shoot film, hashtag buy film not megapixels, extremely common film hashtags that are used by many film photographers. And the final entry on tier 2 is autofocus, which there is a bit of a purist mentality around autofocus versus manual focus because a lot of the older film cameras do not come equipped with autofocus. And so if you are shooting with autofocus, you are likely shooting with a newer film camera that is optimized and easier to use and has the latest technology, blah, blah, blah. That's what I shoot with. You can also shoot with an older film camera which has manual focus, and that takes a little bit more skill and technique to get right. So if you are still just a newbie into film, autofocus is the way to go, and that's why it's on tier 2. So tier 3 is manual focus, and this is not something that I have done very much. I occasionally switch my camera into manual focus if I'm really having a hell of a time with the autofocus, or if I'm using a technique that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Older and more mechanical cameras focus manually, and it does require more skill and technique and just know-how to get the focus right on them. Sometimes the manual focus can have a bit better fidelity than autofocus depending on what area your autofocus is from, so a lot of good photographers shoot manual, and a lot of good photographers shoot auto. I shoot auto, so. Okay, also the tier 3, and I have no idea why this is on tier 3, but it is the exposure triangle. Honestly, like, this is like photography 101. Like, this is the first thing you should learn about photography. I don't know why this is on tier 3. Exposure triangle, almost everybody knows. It's ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, right? Yeah, ISO, aperture, shutter speed. You gotta balance those things to get your exposure right. If you change one, you gotta change the others to compensate. Some cameras have built-in metering, and so that will do it for you, but honestly, you should just know. And if you've been a photographer for more than a year, you probably do just know. So yeah, no idea why that's on tier 3. Another thing on tier 3 is my favorite, and that is expired film. I love expired film, mostly because expired film does tend to be more accessible and cheaper than regular film, which is excellent. And every camera show I've ever been to has some guy at a table with like a bowl of expired film that he's selling for $4 a roll. Oh my god, pick yourself up some of that if he's been storing it properly. And even if it's improperly stored, I mean, it's still worth shooting for $4 a roll. The downside of expired film is that if it is stored improperly, particularly colored film will lose its color and contrast over time and wind up looking kind of murky when it's developed, which sucks. But that can also have kind of an interesting lomographic effect. A lot of people like shooting expired film on point and shoots just to see how messed up their photos can actually turn out. And honestly, I think that's pretty fun. But just understand, if you are shooting with expired film, there is the risk of the roll not really turning out or just not turning out at all. I've had blank rolls, I've had rolls that were accidentally double exposed with somebody's Halloween pictures from like 1980, so all kinds of things can happen. It's a mixed bag. And you're taking that risk because you're spending $4 a roll. Next, we have CLAs, which stands for Clean, Lubricate, Adjust. And this is a service that you can have done to your camera lenses, especially if you notice some kind of dirt in the middle of the lenses or fogging or mold growth sometimes. You can take them in and have them cleaned, lubricated, and adjusted, and that will remove the issues. It's a great way to salvage old film photography lenses, which tend to be significantly cheaper than their modern digital counterparts. And the last bit on tier 3 is something that I've already said, and that is, whoa, Portra is so expensive. And it is. Oh my god. It's way more than you should pay. Don't pay that. Buy something else. That brings us to tier 4. And we are just blasting through the first part of this iceberg, but don't you worry, the next tiers get a little bit more complicated. On tier 4, we have 120 film. It is not called 120mm film. I thought it was. It's not. But you've probably seen this in stores next to 35mm film. I believe it is the second most common type of commercially available film. And it comes in a box that looks like this. You've probably seen it. And it produces a higher resolution image than 35mm film due to having a larger surface area that is exposed to light. Resolution is not the right word, I don't think, but images captured on medium format film are produced with higher fidelity than on 35mm film. And I am not here yet, but I am working on switching to 120 soon because I'm very, very curious about the amount of detail and lack of grain that it can apparently render in an image. Next one is mail-in labs, and this is exactly what it sounds like. They are places that you can find online where you send your film to get developed and they will send you back the negatives and the prints. It can be cheaper than your local lab, or if your local lab does not accommodate specialized needs, there will be a mail-in lab somewhere that can do that. So if you're using a different processing technique, or if you're pushing or pulling, or just doing anything that maybe London Drugs can't accommodate, then a mail-in lab can help you out. This can also be great for people in rural areas who maybe don't have access to anywhere that develops film nearby. Next, we have storing film in the fridge, which I believe, should have been in tier 3, along with expired film, because you can store expired film in the fridge, and if it's stored in the fridge all of its life, it won't expire, or it will, but not as badly. Color film is not shelf stable at room temperature for long periods of time. So if you have color film and you have a bunch of it and you're not going to shoot with it right away, put it in the fridge. I've got mine just in the very top little drawer where there's like garlic, ginger, film. Black and white film I don't think needs to be stored in the fridge, but it can be, so I store mine in the fridge anyway. But black and white film is shelf stable at room temperature, color film is not. And here are some example shots from a roll of film that was stored in a refrigerator for 25 years and was thus almost 25 years past its expiration date, and yet produced beautiful images because it was stored properly. As nice as it is to have all of your film on a nice little shelf that you get to look at, it is much better to have it in the fridge and then have pictures that you get to look at later on. Next we have TLRs, which I did have to look up. We're getting into the territory of things that I have to look up. And it is a twin lens reflex camera. You've probably seen them before and you don't really know why they look like that. They have two lenses. One lens operates the viewfinder and the other lens takes the actual photo. So instead of having a little mirror that flips up when you take the photo, you have the photo-taking lens and the viewfinder lens, and you can look out of both of them simultaneously. This kind of camera is outdated. A lot of them are quite old, and it hasn't been manufactured as anything other than a novelty camera in quite some time due to being replaced with better technology. The last entry on tier 4 is off-camera metering. And this is another one that is like not 100% related to film photography because digital cameras can use this too, but off-camera metering is useful if your camera does not have a built-in light meter, which many older film cameras do not. Apparently, you can actually get an app that will work as a light meter, and my friend has it and she uses it and she says it's actually pretty okay. So that's interesting. I've never tried the apps, but I also Googled it, and Google says they do work. They're just not quite as good, but they're good enough. So get a light meter app if your film camera does not have a built-in light meter. Other than that, handheld light meters can get fairly expensive depending on the level of quality that you need from them. If you're shooting in studio with strobes, that would be kind of a whole other ballpark than if you're just shooting portraits outside or something, but I'm sure somebody down in the comments will have more to say about this one because I am not the most knowledgeable about different metering and exposure techniques. So here we are at the last tier that I will be covering in this video, and that is tier 5. And the first entry on tier 5 is Ansel Adams. And back when I was first thinking about the Photographers in Focus series, I did a bunch of research on Ansel Adams, and then I realized that he was probably too boring and too well covered to actually do a video on. But Ansel Adams was really big into this genre he called pure photography, which had the goal of capturing scenes with as much fidelity and detail as possible. He pioneered the F64 group, which is, I think, exactly what it sounds like. F64 being a very, very high f-stop that would naturally capture a very large plane of perfect focus. But yeah, his whole thing was image fidelity and being as true to life as possible. He captured these absolutely gorgeous landscapes on large format and medium format film. He's considered one of the masters of film photography. The next entry is zone focusing, and I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about manual focus, but zone focusing is a manual focus technique where you create an entire sort of plane of focus and then you lock that in. So it's very good for street photography or dance photography or other genres where you're going to have subjects in motion, and the amount of time that it takes for autofocus to lock onto a subject could potentially be an obstacle. Let's say you lock in focus and everything that's 10 feet away from your camera is going to be in focus. Then if you shoot with a very high f-stop, that gives you a wider plane of focus on either side of that 10-foot plane of focus. So you can actually get, a 5 or 10-foot zone 10 feet away from you in focus. It's great for street photography because you have a subject walk through that zone, they're going to be in focus no matter what. You don't have to fiddle around with the autofocus and then, oh my god, they're gone, or they've changed position, or their shadow's wrong, or whatever. You've caught the photo. The next item on tier 5 is home development, or home dev, and that is exactly what it sounds. It's developing your film at home. I'm not here yet. You need a darkroom or some other system of tanks and solutions and chemicals and chemical disposal, and there's all kinds of things. And people who do it will tell you it's very simple, and perhaps it is, but I've never done it, and it seems very complicated from the outside. Next we have slide film, which is super beautiful and super fun and something that I only recently learned about, and it is a color positive film. So a typical 35mm film will be developed through C41 processing, and this produces a color negative. And you guys know what a negative looks like, I assume, if you're watching the Film Photography Iceberg video. Slide film develops with the E6 processing and instead produces a positive image. So instead of looking all weird when you hold it up to the light, it just looks like a tiny photograph that has perfectly rendered colors. And usually it's got these really, really beautiful and vital colors, and the results can be quite stunning. The only downside is that the process to actually develop the film is much more complicated and much more expensive, and so retail labs tend to only process C41 because it's cheaper and simpler to set up. So I don't know where you would get E6 produced, probably a specialty lab somewhere, and it would probably be a lot more expensive than typical C41 color film. Next we have large format. We've talked about medium format, and so large format is one step up from that. It is any film that is larger than 4 by 5, but it can also be 5x7, 8x10, or even 11x14. Large format film does not come on a roll like medium format and 35mm. It comes in sheets that are held up to the back of the camera with film holding plates. So you've seen a large format camera, I'm sure, and you think of them as being very old, but not all large format cameras are old. They just kind of look like that. This film size obviously allows for a very, very high fidelity, a huge amount of detail in the overall image that is highly coveted by commercial photographers, because a lot of the time, if you compare a film image to a digital image, people actually prefer the film. So along that line of having larger images overall, we've got the next entry, which is 6x9 rangefinders. I did not know what this was, and it was actually very hard to get information on what it was, because there's all kinds of sites selling it, but there's very few sites explaining what the heck it is. But it's very simple. So 120mm film allows you to shoot at a variety of frame sizes. The most common, I believe, being 6x6. You get these square images, but you can also shoot 6x7 and 6x9. So 6x9 images are medium format images, but they're quite large, so you get a higher degree of detail than you would with a traditional medium format square frame. Finally, the last entry that we're going to be talking about today on the Film Photography Iceberg is push development. I knew about pushing film, but I didn't really know what it entailed until I did the research for this video. So there's two aspects to pushing film. The first aspect is pushing it in camera while you're shooting, which is basically underexposing it. So you're metering it as though you're shooting with a higher ISO film. So what I would do if I was pushing, say, an 800 ISO film, I'd put it in, I'd set my ISO to 1600, and then meter it according to it being a 1600 ISO film. And now you may be wondering, doesn't that just underexpose your image? Well, it would, and it does, except that in the development process, you can also push the development. And what that means is that you're leaving it in the developer for a longer period of time, causing the bright areas of the image to expose more. I don't do development, so it's the blind leading the blind here, but the way that I understand it, it can result in higher degrees of contrast because the areas that are not hit by light on the frame, the areas that are just black with the areas that are shadows, don't increase as you leave them. It's not like a camera raw where you can just drag up the brightness scale and have the whole image just blow out. Areas that were not hit, they will stay black. Areas that will hit will continue to develop. And so you can wind up with really, really bright lights and really, really harsh shadows, and that might look weird in certain images, but in images, say, captured on Cinestill 800T, it can have a very desirable and interesting effect because those are typically captured at night and they feature lights. And so the darkness of the shadows doesn't really matter because it's night and you don't want them to be any brighter than black, you know? Anyway, so yeah, Cinestill 800T is extremely commonly pushed, usually to 1600, but sometimes to 3200 ISO, which is 2 stops. And you can also pull film, I'm not gonna talk about that, but that's doing the opposite, where you would shoot Cinestill 800T at like 200 ISO and then just leave it in the developer for less time. Well, I feel like I've talked for like 30 minutes straight. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you are excited for part 2. Next week, we're gonna be talking about some way more in-depth aspects of film photography that I had not heard about until doing the research for this, so that will be lots of fun. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, queries, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I appreciate you guys so much. Leave a like if you liked this video, and I will see you guys next week. In the meantime, I want you to stay sharp, and don't forget to keep shooting. Bye, guys.